Nigel Farage made it quite clear, a fascinating interview in the Times yesterday, that he's looking at the so-called Canada model, which is where a party called Reform, not necessarily the same views, but populist, challenged the Conservatives in 1993. They both lost the election, but subsequently they merged. Reform says it took over the old Conservatives, and it was 13 years before they got back into power. Now, Nigel Farage has talked about hollowing out the Conservative Party. He knows that...
So there's a wider picture here.
Yeah, he knows that the vehicle to power is the Conservative Party, that replacing, the greatest election-winning machine of the last 20 years, last 200 years, is very difficult. That's what he's interested in.
That Nigel Farage will also take over as leader of Reform. Why the U-turn? Why is Nigel Farage deciding to go for this?
Well, apart from anything else, he's a publicity genius, isn't he? I mean, last week he got on all the airwaves talking about why he wasn't standing. This week he's changed his mind. He's back on the airwaves. He's going to be on 2 BBC programmes running. He did, of course, a Question Time last week. This week, presumably, he's going to be representing Reform in the multi-headed debate that the BBC is having on Friday. So he's good at the publicity. He's got himself out there. In a sense, I think, almost more interesting than him standing in Clacton, which is, probably a winnable seat. If he does get elected to Parliament, this will be 8th time lucky for him. He stood 8th time before in other constituencies. It's winnable because it has been held before by UKIP, Douglas Carswell fought a by-election there when he defected from the Conservatives, and then he got elected once more. Has to be said, Giles Watling, actually current Conservative in the last Parliament.
Yeah, candidate.
He is a, he's very much a leaver. He got 75% of the vote last time round. So
he's similar to Nigel Farage in his outlook?
In his outlook, yeah. And also quite charismatic. So and he's a local man. He's already made this crack that he's looking forward to showing Nigel around. So... That, I think, that battle, he may or may not get elected. The important thing is that for the duration of the election campaign, and he says for the next 5 years, he's made himself party leader, which does guarantee he'll be there to get the message out, which cheers him up. And frankly, Richard Tice had not been having anything like the impression that Farage has had.
What do you make of the decision by Richard Tice as leader to then step aside for Nigel Farage? I think my question would be, if this doesn't work out for Nigel Farage, does Richard Tice just step back into that? Does Nigel Farage go to America?
Well, it's all very peculiar, isn't it? Because it's not a democratic party with members or anything else like that. Nigel
Ben
Farage...
Habib didn't know about the decision, really.
Nigel Farage has the majority of shares, so what he says goes. And in that sense, Richard Tice has been moved aside. He's doing it with a good grace. He, of course, is also going to stand for Parliament and possibly, the extra attention that Nigel Farage...
If you were Richard Tice, would you have stepped aside? I always thought that, consistency of leader and Richard Tice has been the person.
Richard Tice has put a lot into it. He's also, unlike Nigel Farage, put a lot of his own money into it, reportedly, something like £1 million. But I think what is really interesting about this is I do think this represents quite a significant change of strategy for Reform, in as much as Richard Tice was, basically saying we're going to take on the Conservative Party by fighting them and replacing them. Nigel Farage made it quite clear, a fascinating interview in the Times yesterday, that he's looking at the so-called Canada model, which is where a party called Reform, not necessarily the same views, but populist, challenged the Conservatives in 1993. They both lost the election, but subsequently they merged. Reform says it took over the old Conservatives, and it was 13 years before they got back into power. Now, Nigel Farage has talked about hollowing out the Conservative Party. He knows that...
So there's a wider picture here.
Yeah, he knows that the vehicle to power is the Conservative Party, that replacing, the greatest election-winning machine of the last 20 years, last 200 years, is very difficult. That's what he's interested in. I think the thing to watch is the interplay between Farage as leader and the Conservative Party, because, right now he's made them look fools. But as we know, there are people in the Conservative Party who have said repeatedly that they would welcome Nigel Farage to join them. I think if he does join them, he's only interested in moving towards the leadership. But I think it's going to be a different dynamic for Reform from now on. In the short run, it looks like it's going to take votes from the Conservatives.
Yeah.
So in the short run, it's good news for Labour. In the long run, it may mean that Nigel Farage succeeds in moving the Conservative Party even further to the right.
Yeah, because you've got groups there ready to go,
Yeah.
haven't you? Groups
Yeah.
of, well, were MPs, now
Yeah.
candidates. Some of them
Yeah.
won't be staying, of
I mean, it's
course. But
interesting.
Popcon and the Popular Conservative movement.
Yeah, and you've got, I mean, the interesting thing is on sort of in that area, you've got Farage, Boris Johnson and Liz Truss all running after Donald Trump and sort of seeing themselves as Donald Trump. And he, of course, Trump has done the same thing in America in as much as he's been an entrist in the Republican Party and has managed to refashion it in his own image.
A few messages in from you listening. Thank you so much for getting these in, by the way. Farage won't commit to 5 years. He doesn't want to be an MP. He just wants the attention, says this person who has texted in that. What else have we got here?
Well, he said Giles Wattling's not a leaver. He's consistently voted in Parliament against the EU. So.
Yeah. A lot of people here saying you can't ignore the fact that Nigel Farage is a racist. Why aren't you talking about that? Someone here saying Ben Habib ignoring that everyone's sick of people who brought us Brexit. We were talking about, why it's important to have reform there, not mentioning Brexit enough. And of course, Nigel Farage will tell you he's not racist. He's trying to stem immigration in a responsible way. He's already called it the immigration election.
There is a very interesting video led by Donkeys, which has done Nigel Farage's life history, the positions he's taken, and people can make their own judgment on that. I mean, what I think is interesting is that the man who, in my view, more than Dominic Cummings, delivered Brexit to this country is now really not talking about Brexit at all. He's talking about immigration.
Yeah, that's interesting to note. I'm going to move on to polling now because this is the other big story of the evening. And this is that Labour could be on target to win an even bigger majority than Tony Blair managed in 1997. The latest poll published by YouGov this afternoon forecast that Labour would be on course for a 194-seat majority with 422 MPs in total. It leaves the Conservatives on just 140, which is a loss of 232 seats. We'll get Adam Boulton's thoughts. We are, of course, in the midst of Boulton's back half here on the evening edition. We're tapping into the wisdom of Adam Boulton, but we're also going to be joined now by the man behind the polling, Patrick English, Director of Political Analytics for YouGov. Good evening to you, Patrick.
Good evening. How are you doing?
Thank you. Well, look, thank you for being with us. I'm doing fine. Thank you very much. Tell me about this poll and the reasons behind it. I spoke to Michael Howard, Lord Howard, earlier, who seemed very untrusting of it. Tell us why it's significant, the manner in which you've conducted it.
Well, certainly I think it's worth saying straight away that not a single vote has been cast yet. And this is what we might call a nowcast, a projection of what we think the House of Commons would look like given the current voting patterns and given the type of voters who live in each constituency, and a model that we can fit using statistics and computer science to look at how those constituencies would vote based on who lives in them and what their current vote intention is. Now, I think this poll is significant for probably three main reasons. One is it is a huge poll. We spoke to almost 60,000 people in order to get this sample together for this MRP poll, so way above and beyond the usual sort of 1,000, 2,000 samples we typically see in a vote intention poll. The other is that the method for MRP is something that we at YouGov have proudly used for quite a long time now. We brought it into the UK in 2017, and that was the poll, that was the method that correctly first anticipated that Theresa May would lose her majority in that election, contrary to expectations at the time. It also was successfully, in terms of predicting Boris Johnson's win in 2019, and we used it recently in Spain to get the general election right there in 2023, local elections in 2023 and 2024 here. So it's a method that we trust. It's very, it's a strong method. It's a robust method, and I think probably the third reason is it's quite impactful. I think it's an MRP poll is something that people will sit up and pay attention to. It's not just an ordinary vote attention poll for the reasons that I already described. It's something that when this comes out, and certainly we kind of privileged in our position when YouGov puts an MRP poll out, people do very much pay attention to it. And I think it's because of that record stretching back to 2017.
Yeah. What do you do with the undecided?
It's a really good question. So MRP works by looking at all the different types of people and their vote intention and matching them to those types of people in the population in different constituencies. So it will look and see, okay, what are the women who are over 50s without degrees who live in the north of England? How are they telling us they're going to vote? And it will split those into those who have a vote intention and those who don't. It won't look at those who don't have a vote intention, but it will use the characteristics of all the different types of people that might stand for those people that don't know what their vote intention is to produce a probabilistic model of what those segments of the population are going to do. And then you project that across all the constituencies, given all the wealth of information we have, and that gives you your projection.